commencer, je commence.
Je sens que je vais commencer parce que là, tu vois, tu vois, la biodiversité, moi, tu vois, ça m'interpelle.
Surtout son effondrement.
Oui, notamment. Plus son effondrement.
Plus son effondrement. Si ça pouvait disparaître, d'ailleurs, ça nous arrangerait.
Oui, moi aussi, là, parce qu'il y en a marre, hein. Toutes ces bestioles partout, là. Mettez du béton, merde. Des plantes en plastique, du béton.
Oui.
Good evening, good evening. Thank you for being here still at 7 p.m. Well, it's getting a bit cooler. We're here to talk about the biodiversity tonight, the irreversible collapse of biodiversity. You know, Raphaël Legendre, BFM Business. I'm co-facilitator of the semi-plenary session with Patrice GEOFFRON, to whom I will give the floor in a minute. Just before that, let me introduce the guest. From left to right, Antoine FRÉROT, CEO of Veolia, Dr. Naoko ISHII from University of Tokyo, Vice President of the University of Tokyo. Thank you, Madame, for being with us tonight. Brief Rocher of the group Rocher group. Justin VAИSSSE, Director General of the Paris Forum on Peace, and also Beatrice WEDER di MAURO, for President of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Give them a round of applause for being brave enough to be here tonight. So, talk to Patrice GEOFFRON. Thank you, Raphael. Hello. I think you can applaud yourselves as well, because, you know, after already 2 days of, you know, steaming days, you know, to be here at 7 p.m., you know, deal with the reality, the shock of reality of the loss of biodiversity. Congratulations. You know, I'm not sure I wouldn't have done it if he had not been invited to take the floor. So anyway, so a couple of figures to start with. 75% of disappearance of wild vertebrates in the last 50 years. Rhythm, you know, loss of biodiversity is 100 times higher than what was seen in the last first species extinction of the past, which took place over a longer period. And there is what we call the 5 cavalries, horsemen of apocalypse. But anyway, climate change, different use of land and deforestation, and also beyond the 5 horsemen there is us. Us, not just us, but human activities. And clearly this is an issue which is quite complex. So what can economists do in this? We economists, and this is my core business, we love talking about climate, and then we can link up to some metrics for concentration of greenhouse gas and price of CO2, and then more complex issues. But anyway, fairly easy to deal with when you compare this to the complexity of the loss of biodiversity and the economic impact. Figures are there to justify your presence tonight. About 50% of the world GDP comes from domains of activity which are directly linked to the quality of biodiversity. Farming, of course, agriculture, but not only. But if you want an order of magnitude that would concern us in Europe, it is the case at different levels. About 3/4 of businesses, European businesses. So clearly, this is a very serious topic from an economic viewpoint, and which does not escape what we see in the environmental aspect. You know, the cost of the lack of action. You know, if we act today, would cost us twice, half of what it would cost us in 10 years. So probably 10 times less than it would be if we act in 10 years. So it should be a warning signal. No. In order to not to depress you totally, so well, unlike the climate, which corresponds to global externality, well, there is always someone who raises their hand and says, oh yeah, but we Europeans, we French, we don't emit, and so on and so forth. What should we act when the Americans or the Chinese or whatever For biodiversity, they could have a good alignment between the site of action and the site of the benefits of that action. Could be the case, for example, and we see it probably in the coming years, with renaturation and the effort of reintroduction of biodiversity in the city of Aix, and we'll see core benefits in terms of biodiversity and adaptation of cities, but not only. So, to the effect of climate change. Last point, and last but not least, if we dig a bit, well, if you look at the return of experience and the economic business models of companies, we see a lot of things. About 12 years ago, I animated the same conference. Clearly, they were, well, the portfolio was not as rich as what we see today between observations of satellite data, and which give us numeration of the loss of biodiversity, the regain of biodiversity, and of course the AI, and of course biotechnology, and many things that which are not necessarily will be less mature than they are today. But anyway, I'm absolutely convinced that these reasons for hope will occupy us in the next 15 minutes. Raphael, you get the floor. Thank you, Patrice.
So yes, we can give him a round of applause, although we don't want to applaud these findings which send a chill up our spine. Antoine FRÉROT, I will begin with you. In Veolia, you manage water, waste, energy. You're a global player in more than 100 countries. You are a key player in ecological transition, as you say, with the mission of consolidating the world. So concretely, how does Veolia act to reduce its impact, the impact of its businesses on biodiversity? And what levers do you think are the most promising to reduce, at the industrial scale, these pressures on the environment? Good evening, everybody. And first of all, thank you for being here so late in the day. I think that we should begin by re-explaining why biodiversity is important. For a long time, this position hasn't been clearly thought out. We talked about the protection of the polar bears, of bees. Biodiversity is not just an obsession of naturalists and aesthetics. The disappearance of the polar bear is a symptom of the deterioration of Arctic ecosystems that regulate our climate. The disappearance of bees. The thing is that their pollinization, 30% of world global food depends on their pollinization. And my neighbor has just reminded that the World Bank has just assessed that 50% of the world GDP is directly related to nature. So if nature deteriorates, then there will be economic impacts. The second thing is that, yes, biodiversity is declining, and it's not the first time. Scientists have showed that since the Earth has existed, that there were 5 other major periods of degradation or extinction of biodiversity that have come one after the other. And another biodiversity took over. And we are no doubt in the 6th, but this 6th has 2 characteristics. First of all, it's much faster than what we assess the 5 others were. And second, there's no doubt that it's directly related to human activity. And therefore, the fate of biodiversity that we know today is directly correlated with the fate of the ecological transformation of our society. The ecological transformation broaches 2 problems. Pollution, all pollutions, the most difficult pollutions, and the most frequent pollutions. And of course, pollutions have a direct impact on biodiversity. The poison we pour into nature destroy biodiversity, but wastewater left in the rivers and lakes kill fish, eutrophies the waterways, and degrade and also make biodiversity disappear. So pollution has a direct impact on biodiversity. And the second main topic that the ecologic transformation looks at is the excessive extraction of renewable resources with regard to their natural renewable. Therefore, excessive extraction of water dries up wetlands and has a direct impact on the biodiversity there. The destruction of forests or extracting more raw materials, all of this has an impact on biodiversity. So the question is whether the biodiversity disappears inevitably is the same as whether or not we will succeed in the ecological transformation of society. And the good news, and maybe this will be my second to conclude quickly, the good news is that yes, it is possible. Yes, we can succeed in the ecological transformation of our society, and we can succeed in this because we already have a large number of solutions, more than two-thirds at acceptable costs, and therefore this disappearance or degradation of biodiversity is not irreducible. We are not condemned. Thank you very much, Mr. FRÉROT.
Dr. Naoko, you are a professor and executive vice president of the University of Tokyo, and you, according to you, the problem is systemic. Is that right? Our economy ignores the real value of nature. So, what could be an economic system? What could be an economic system aligned with the planetary requirements and without going into utopia?
Thank you so much. I very much agree with you, Patrice, that saying that nature, biodiversity and nature can be a uniting factor of the entire globe. Because entire today, I have seen that the people's minds are very much occupied with conflict, confrontation, the geopolitics, and the fractured world. But I firmly believe that safeguarding the nature, including biodiversity, can be really a united force that to collectively to see the future. So I very much agree with you, and I'm glad that you started with that. And I also like very much what Tony started, science. Science is exceedingly important, and it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer. We were at the verge of collapse from the planetary boundaries. That the scientists identified the nine important subsystems to keep our planet resilient and stable. And according to them, we have already transgressed 6 of 9, which does include climate change, but definitely biodiversity, which is a deep red in this the danger zone. So fundamentally, scientists are telling us is that it's time for us to reset our economic relationship with the nature. These two systems, economic system and the natural system, are actually fighting with each other. In the past, maybe before the fixed extinction time, maybe it was okay because the planet is vast and the human is small. Now it's changed. We become so powerful, and we really hit the carrying capacity of the nature, planet system, almost everywhere. That's why I think it's time for us to rethink that reset our economic system within harmony in nature. Then the question is, how can we really do it? One thing I don't necessarily agree with Tony is that do we really have thousands of solutions to reset our economic system or not? Before I joined the university, I was the CEO of the GEF, and we have done maybe hundreds of projects, nature projects. 80% of them are rated satisfactory. Then why we continue to lose nature? Something doesn't add up. And to me, our current system doesn't really take into account the fullest value of the natural capital. And unless we change this accounting system, auditing system, an investor system, those market system, we will continue to do what we have already done. So it's time to think from project by project fragmentation toward system change. That's what I meant by system change.
Thank you, Doctor. Un grand reset, un retour à zéro.
So back to zero, we rebuild. Bris Rocher, you are the president of the Group Rocher, more than 2 billion euros of turnover, 14,000 employees across the world. And your company is a company with a mission And that is the raison d'être of your company. How today can you convince other economic players that we must reform our practices in depth? Yes, good evening, everybody. So as you just mentioned, the group has become a company with a mission in the sense of the law voted in 2019. This was a way of expliciting that which is too implicit and to come back to the company's roots, its raison d'être, and also to reconnect men and women with nature. And if we've come back to roots, it is to come back to the foundations of what the Rocher company group brand and my father was. My grandfather had an experience very young that changed him entirely. My grandfather always had health issues, rather serious health issues. In particular, in a poorly heated boarding school, to the extent that he was no longer able to go to school, and his parents home-taught him. And he and his father were very, very close, and the culture was very strong. And this very close relationship crystallized something between them, except that in 1944, a drama arose. He lost his father suddenly, and he took refuge in the forest for 2 years. He didn't sleep in the woods, but he spent his days there, and it brought him peace and comfort. And it consoled him. And then he became aware that nature had a positive impact on his well-being. And he therefore decided to take action in favor of nature. This nourished his deep-fed conviction, which has today become a collective necessity. Biodiversity, the state of biodiversity is alarming. In 2019, an international report declared that out of the 9 million animal and plant species, 1 million were threatened by extinction for all the reasons that we know. And this loss of biodiversity causes a certain number of harmful consequences that have already been mentioned. The UN, 1 year after this 2019 report, said that the ISHII agreement was a failure. Only 6 out of the 19 were partially achieved, and therefore it was a failure. And so I will conclude with just one thing. With regard to what my grandfather experienced, I think that it's essential to address the biodiversity crisis. But for me, it's not just a question of a biodiversity crisis. It's also a crisis of the relationship between humans and nature. And which is terrible, because we are a produce of nature. Biologically and genetically, we're programmed to live in contact with nature. And it is by reconnecting with nature that we find the necessary resources to halt this terrible drama that we're experiencing now. Thank you very much. Justin Weiss, your General Manager of the Forum of Paris for the Peace, relating to the demographic pressure and the need to decorrelate economic activity and destruction of living beings. What tools can we use to allow this short-term decoupling, and how can we build global governance that is efficient in a fragmented world?
Spécialiste de biodiversité, je suis historien.
I'm not an expert in biodiversity. I'm a historian, and I deal with an organization which does global governance. So I'd like to take a step back. We, sapiens, we are an invasive species and destructive species. Our arrival in new lands usually will cause a collapse of local biodiversity. You might have read this in the book from Yuval Harari, Sapiens, when he describes the arrival, minus 45,000 humans in Australia, which led to the disappearance of about 90% of all, great animals in Australia, over 50 kilos. And he takes this as a symbol. He says, whenever man goes somewhere, he starts destructing things. Well, it was demographic growth. We were 192 million in years ago. We were less than a billion in less than 2 centuries, but we'll be 10 billion, in 50. You know, our ancestors were not in full harmony with nature. That's not true. You know, they were highly destructive. They would clear up everything. They would burn land to do agriculture. They destroyed a lot of exterminated of species, even when they were just harvesters and hunters. So that worked when there were only a few hundred millions on Earth. But now, you know, demographic growth the collapse will not, the decrease will not happen before 2086. So, as Antoine Prévost said, we have to decorrelate our economic activity from our impact on biodiversity and to try to compensate for the the current damage. So, we want to transform our practice with three main lines: finance, but we'll let Beatrice talk about that, technology, and I think it is key. We've made a lot of headways, a lot of progress. In the US, you talked about pollution. In the US, for example, in 1970, they would emit 31 million tons of sulfur dioxide, for example. In 2020, it was below 2 million. So clearly, you know, we can reduce pollution and we can do less toxic. Agriculture is key in this process because, and this is again a paradox, that is, often we blame intensive agriculture and so on and so forth, but what destroys, what is a problem for biodiversity in this climate is actually the loss of forests and natural land for agriculture. Therefore, if you intensify agriculture, means that you reduce part of the problem with biodiversity. With the technological tools we have now, with the intensification of farming, breeding, we can use less space and regreen the earth. And third tool, and this is where we have the Forum for Peace wants to be active, the global governance, that is, we talked about the ISHII objectives, to try to agree to have a framework within which our activities will transform to about the equivalent of the Paris Agreement 10 years ago for agriculture. So my time is over, just mentioning the various efforts, but there was the oceans, we saw that in Nice last month, the economic Montreal agreement signed in 2022, which sets new objectives and which is good, and as well the treaty on the high seas. All this is important. I will not dwell on that, but all this could give us tools to transform the intensity of our impacts on biodiversity versus our demography, and this will be the key for remediation. Thank you. Beatrice will talk finance. Will you talk about the refunding of the natural market? So how do you raise private capitals at the scale to avoid the collapse of biodiversity? 3 minutes.
Merci. Oui.
Thank you. But I must begin with a few figures. The WWF considers that 70% of global populations of species have declined in the 60 last years, and the ecosystems that support life. But to place this on a scale that is easy to understand, the time that I took to read this sentence, our planet has already lost the equivalent of 10 football fields of tropical forest. So this happens every 20 seconds. So it's obvious that we must do something about it. And the voluntary carbon markets at the moment are the main channel for carbon and nature, and it doesn't work. They are defective. They do not valorize nature. They lack consistency and credibility. So what we propose in a report that we published just 3 days ago in the CPR, and this is free. Yes, you can find them free of charge on the site. So what we propose is a market that is based on nature shares. And just like company shares, you participate in the benefits and the profits when there are profits, And nature shares allow the participation in the profits of biodiversity and carbon absorption. And what is important are the questions of land ownership also. So there's a risk of non-permanence because it is a legal system and not a small project, and the dividends can be retained. The project at the legal level reduces costs, and we must organize these nature shares. So we will provide mandates for institutional investors that guarantee stability. So we think that these could make a major contribution to growing the value of nature and to mobilizing private capital that is required to avoid an irreversible ecological collapse. Thank you. We can see that there are solutions. We see solutions exist, and also the disappearance of biodiversity remains often a secondary challenge in the climate policies. Dr. Naoko ISHII, what is your opinion on that? Why is it a secondary stake in the climate policies, the collapse of biodiversity, whereas it is indissociable from climate change? So in public policies, is the protection of biodiversity a primary stake today?
I'm sorry, I'm not fully sure if I get your question right or not, but you were asking that why biodiversity.
The topic of biodiversity safety is high enough in the political agenda to resolve the problem.
Why nature is not?
Yes.
Well, at least climate change has captured the political imagination of the politicians because people have been affected, directly affected. So there is quite a strong political pressure to take actions. But also that climate change is in a sense easier to account for the negativity because of the carbon that we can think about the carbon tax or carbon pricing. The challenge of the nature is partly because it's so close to us, but never have been really priced adequately, so that this pricing mechanism has not been really tested. And for so long, as I mentioned, we take the nature for granted. It's just there. And because it's free goods, we continue to eat up the nature and treat nature as a free goods, and then that it goes to this the current dire situation. Then that finally, I think many of us wake up and think that we have to do something. But then here is a wall of the current economic system, because our system, unfortunately, is still very much of fossil fuel based, so that the emission can be priced easily. Well, at least we know how to price it, but nature has not been treated as a capital, natural capital, to create the growth or the revenue. So that's why this system change of how we want to account for the natural capital, not just only risk point of view, but as the growth point of view. How can we recognize the nature as an asset class? That has been really the challenge, and because it requires the entire market ecosystem needs to move up together, not only accounting, the auditors, but also regulators, that the central bank, that rating agencies, then investors' perception. The entire market system needs to shift together, and that's why it has been so challenging. And we are a bit of struggling that which piece that we can push to shift this entire ecosystem, move up, so that we can see that the value of the nature as a monetized value of nature on the balance sheet.
C'est un peu ce que vous nous disiez, Patrice Geoffron, en introduction, c'est-à-dire que ne pas s'occuper de la biodiversité.
If we don't deal with biodiversity, it will cost us, and this is an investment that could be profitable. At the same time, Antoine, FRÉROT, we can see some kind of a trend and antagonism, to protect nature in the short term could cost more. And we see some kind of a return of environmental policies Well, anyway, at the European level, so at the French level, we talk a lot about it in the CF2D, CSRD, you know. So when you are an industrial leader like you, those European norms or directives, how do you address them? Have we gone too far in Europe for that? Or do we have to step back, or do we have to continue?
To begin with, I'm going to add something to your previous question. Why our public policies are not taking biodiversity into account. Because I think that for people to understand that the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and therefore the climate and the biodiversity cycle are entirely correlated. In many spaces, when it's hotter, the water evaporates from the ground. There are fewer plants that capture less carbon and which contribute to the heat. And therefore, there is even less heat and less carbon sequestration in the soil. So it's a vicious circle. The water cycle in soils, that of carbon and that of biodiversity, are entirely integrated. And this is why we must work on the questions of pollution and the extraction of natural resources. So now let me come to your question. First of all, for a company, the social and environmental performance must be taken with the same level of demand as economic and financial performance. A company is an object with plural performances. And to measure these performances, it is necessary to have some landmarks. I don't see any other solution than to ask the political world to fix these landmarks rather than just let those who want to look after it do it, as we unfortunately left the measure of economic performance to the financial world. It's important that the political world gets involved. And for us as Europeans, of course, the European dimension is the right dimension. So I applaud the fact that the European Parliament, or even the European Council, has decided to propose a way of measuring the extra financial performance of companies. And it's important to leave it in their hands, because if we don't leave it in their hands, it will get into other hands. And just as, the measure of financial economic performance was grabbed by American finance people, we don't want that biodiversity to get into the hands. It's a question of sovereignty. Yes, because when we let the financial world determine the rules to measure economic performance, we shouldn't be surprised that the economy is in the service of finance and not the contrary. I was going to ask you the same question, Beatrice. No, but having said this, we need to do it properly. Meaning, well, we need to... It must be able to be applied to the largest number of companies possible. And the CSRD is far too complicated, so it must be simplified. But we shouldn't throw the baby down the drain with the bathwater. We must simplify it and also maybe look at the life of companies within this area. But we must maintain this normative aspect at that level to stop it from falling into the wrong hands. That's what you can see at the European level. Patrice, you're at the head of a European think tank. So you're tightly connected to the European instances. What is your view of the evolution of doctrine at that level?
I mean, nature right now is in danger from two sides, biodiversity and nature. It's human intervention and then the human on the climate. So we cannot completely detach also from the climate discussion. And the backlash that is happening at the moment is against climate policies at the very fundamental, against regulation and against pricing. So all of those, on all of those levels, we have issues and new discussions. And it is true, yes, firms are looking around and saying, well, do I really need to do this? Let's wait, let's see what the European Commission says in the end and whether this is still necessary or not. But what is very important to realize is that the future of the climate and of nature is not so much in Europe, it is in the rest of the world. Most of the carbon emissions are there, most of the growth of carbon emissions are there, and yes, we can do things without the US. Excuse me. Yes, so yes, we can do also coalitions that do not include the US. Building coalitions around climate and nature is one of the big jobs, and I am actually quite confident that the European Commission right now, still, although it is going for simplification and so on, but they know this and they understand that building these kind of coalitions is what we should be doing.
Oui, c'est donc plus un ajustement qu'un recul.
Adjustment more than pulling back.
Peu provoque, c'est ce qu'on...
So let me ask a provocative question. Can we conciliate economic development and protection of the living beings? Yes, the proof. And the same question on norms and standards. I think that it's funny. I was listening to a debate in a previous edition of this festival on should companies engage or not, and the debate was around the purchasing power of consumers. And they said, well, consumers want to purchase products with a value for money that was satisfactory for them, and you know, CSR has a cost. So you said this debate was interesting. And I intervened and I said, I think that we're focusing a lot on the consumers. It's interesting, but you know, that's not just the consumers. There are also the men and women in the company, because the company is a human adventure. It's a group of people who commit to surpass themselves and engage in an adventure. So for me, a company with a mission that commits is a company that engages all of its stakeholders. And if the raison d'être of a company is honey, the company with a mission is royal jelly, because it reinforces the brand of a company, it attracts talents, and because a company is a group of people, if we can attract men and women with talent, it's better, because they will find the solutions to overcome this constraint or challenge of CSR has a cost, and can we get the consumers to pay for it? Well, a lot of financial capital is essential to develop your company, but human capital is just as essential, if not more. And with this status of a company with a mission comes the company culture, which has found legal support. Because what is human capital? It's innovative production. It's values, the reinvention of organizations, creative innovation, collective creation. It's all of this. And this is what allows us to overcome the obstacles ahead of us. So yes, it's possible. And I even think that companies are obliged to commit before any legal or regulatory constraint obliges them to do so, because it will be imposed sooner or later, considering the difficulties ahead of us. And it's better to anticipate this, because if we anticipate things, it will cost a lot less, rather than just kind of trying to catch up with the train. And the same thing is the same for true. You know, how does it move for you in the world of entrepreneurs? And then a question for Antoine for the big bosses. In the world of entrepreneurs, what's happening? Are things changing? Well, yes, there are companies that have becoming aware, but I wouldn't say that it's general. There is a lot of work left to be done. But what do I see? I do see something. Firstly, companies are natively responsible. An entrepreneur, before the 15th century, when he created a company, took a risk together. But it was a risk where if he failed, he was ruined. Then something happened in the 19th century, a legal innovation the anonymous company, and there was a transfer of responsibility because there was a distance created between the entrepreneur stakeholder and the stakeholders themselves who became investors. And investors today, when they invest in a company, are only responsible for the money that they've put up. If he loses just his shares, but not everything. Therefore, a transfer of responsibility, little by little, came to rise between the stakeholders, owners, and the company. We went from total quality to responsible governance to social responsibility of companies. And I consider that, in fine, the status of a company with a mission translates this transfer of responsibility that has occurred over time. But my main message is to say that companies must engage before they are obliged to do so. I would not change a word of what Antoine said earlier on CSRD, the CR3Ds, etc. I would just add one thing. Beyond the fact that I'm not particularly a fan of an excess of bureaucracy, etc., and things must be simplified. If we impose things upon ourselves in Europe, we must make sure that there are common rules and that the Americans and the Chinese companies apply the same rules.
Antoine FRÉROT.
Yes, let's not shoot ourselves in the foot. Yes, when 10 years ago, when we started saying that the company did not serve only one objective, that the company doesn't belong to the shareholders who were owning the shares, but not the company. Well, that was about 10 years ago. We were very, very few to say that, and highly criticized. Today, this is no longer criticized. The fact that a company serves several objectives. Of course, it is a private undertaking, but also it has a general interest. When a company dies, there are so many people who are impacted, you know. If it was just, you know, to the service of a few, well, people would not cry. But, you know, a company has a general interest entity with social objectives, societal, environmental, commercial, and economic and financial. So, and this is shared more and more. The fact that CSR was one time like the sort of all-purpose thing, well, many considered it as like, you know, a cherry on the cake. Well, but anyway, if the CSR, you know, is an objective, you know, and if we remove it, you are you know, you kill part of the raison d'être of the business of the company. And if many of the chef d'entreprise managers do not share this idea that company has to have social performances, plural performances, bring the proof of this plural purpose, with the notion of progress, to measure it and publish it. And even though it's not yet a majority, it is making headway still, and we didn't build Paris overnight. Friedman, the economist who imposed the financial economy and actionnarial of enterprises, his Nobel Prize was in 65, and his triumph was in 1980. And so, and of course, there was Reagan and Thatcher helping him. So we cannot change an economic system overnight. You cannot make it evolve in 5-6 years. But I think a lot of improvements have been achieved for the last 10 years, and I'm very optimistic about the fact that we will make it. And I'm very much like Bris Rocher anyway. If we don't do it, we will have to one day, one way or another. Naoko, ISHII, I can see you agreeing with what you're hearing now. So those two managers, you know, but, you know, so things are moving. So what do you think?
Yes, things are moving, and I very much like that Antoine mentioned the ecological transformation. And actually, the source of that idea is actually very provocative. I think it's also in China, that China promoted this idea of ecological civilization. This is slightly broader the ecological transformation, because it's trying to set or reset human economic relationship with nature and culture. So this idea of how we can reset our system with a broader natural system really comes from very deep from China. And based on that, they have already developed the natural capital accounting. They have used it to compensate the people. So it's not just an academic exercise. It's actually being very well implemented. My last point that you mentioned, everybody mentioned the importance of standardization of the measurement, standardize the measurement, so that and Beatrice is quite right that we don't necessarily have to do only the Europe, but outside Europe, ISSB, this is a standard of that measurement, is now adopted by 38 jurisdictions, and particularly the ones in Asia, Africa, are quite vocal because they see it's an investment opportunity to attract the private sector money to their own countries. So there are a lot of progress, not only within Europe, but also the broader, the globe. So I think that on that one, I'm more optimistic about it.
Bon, un message d'optimisme, c'est bien.
A message of optimism, that's good. What concrete coalition should we develop today in terms of governance? Once again, and who must act first? We can see that companies are moving, is global governance following. So our credo is multiplayer. We consider that formal multilateralism, that of the United Nations, is very important. It remains at the heart of international life. But in the need to act, we need a multiplayer coalition, which includes the private sector, the big philanthropic foundations, NGOs, development banks, development agencies, and others. That is the right people to have around the table, depending on the subject, because the coalitions are variable. The second question is that in the current landscape marked by the arrival of an American administration that is making fun of these situations and is ready to lower all of the environmental standards and therefore to go for the cheapest bidder, how do we create new coalitions? And that is also the objective of the report that Jean-Pierre Ferry and Beatrice published. And here I must say that what we saw in recent months is quite reassuring, because for the time being, we don't have many countries that have joined the United States in their rejection of the Paris Agreement. Here we're talking about climate. But also we've seen this for the Seville conference at the beginning of the week. That was on development, not specifically on environment, but we saw a relatively robust text from the other countries. The Ocean Summit in Nice last month, we also saw progress. We're not there yet for plastics. We saw that that didn't work in the conference in last December, but we can see that there is a sufficient reservoir of political will among the states and, of course, among the other players to take action. So we mustn't say that, no, Trump is turning his back. But to the contrary, that should be an encouragement to form new coalitions around each of the problems at different levels. And we must remember, of course, that the global architecture, global governance is useful to unify the different players. And if there is a dissensus or a disagreement, then at one point we must take our responsibilities as Europeans, and we do this a lot already. It shouldn't be done for competitive advantages for Europe, but at one point we must take our responsibilities, including through mechanisms such as border taxes, CBAM, etc. Do you agree with this, Beatrice? Multilateralism is not dead yet?
Multilateralisme n'est pas mort.
Multilateralism is not dead, but it has...
Forming coalitions which are across different types of concerns, and will include different numbers and clubs of countries. So if we are talking about climate and trade, for instance, the CBAM and the carbon pricing that the European Union has in place can be happening for other countries, but they would be different countries than if we are talking about financing, for instance, the energy transition, which is very, very urgent and needs financing in Africa. For the first type, we need China. And then there are the questions of how to organize negative emissions. How do we organize carbon extraction? That's, by the way, what I am relating here are the different proposals that we have in this report I was talking about. It's about building coalitions across different types of groups, but also different concerns, linking them. In all of them, the European Union can play a very large role, but we need the rest of the world, parts of the rest of the world, and we need to give them incentives to join. For the negative carbon emissions, technological ones can be organized, and the nature-based ones that we have been talking about can be organized in such a market that it would both account for negative emissions and biodiversity restoration. That is the proposal. It is possible.
Merci, merci pour ce message d'optimisme. Je vais faire un dernier tour de table avant qu'on passe le micro dans la salle. Je suis sûr que vous avez beaucoup de questions. L'un après l'autre, en 1 minute. S'il vous plaît, on va commencer par vous.
Sorry, 1 minute, okay? If you had to choose only one measure, priority measure, economical, political, societal, 1 minute to stop the disappearance of the living species. So what should we need to implement it quickly? So 1 minute. If only one measure to improve, to apply everywhere for all pollutions, for all excessive extraction of renewable resources, of the principle, the polluters pay. And the fees would help those who depollute. If you pollute more, the way of polluting it will be more expensive than depolluting. People will stop. So we know the solutions to remove pollution. It's accessible. We don't have to choose between the end of the world and the end of the month. To work, to do clean work, it's a bit more expensive, fair enough, but it's feasible. Polluter pays. You know, you pollute, you pay. At every level, if we use incentive measures for those who do the depollution, you know, so that would not, it has to be well received, and polluters, you know, this is the main solution to be generalized. You know, the polluters pays. And supported, you know, Naoko. Don't put the money in the basket, you know, use it to depollute. Naoko, priority of priorities, how do you get there?
My goal is to put the nature on the balance sheet as an investable asset, because it has not been really regarded as even that than the productive capital. Time has come that we need to update our economic system, value the nature, and integrate it in every aspect of economic decision making.
Bris Rocher.
I would tend towards transparency. If it's public, it obliges you to progress. For example, I've just taken up the presidency of a consortium in our sector. It's called the Green Impact Index, the equivalent of the Nutri-Score in the food industry. And the fact of displaying the social and environmental impact of your products allows you to inform consumers of what they're consuming, but it also obliges the company to make progress. And so from that point of view, it's very virtuous. So I think that transparency obliges us to make things public and obliges us to move ahead. Very clearly, the intensification of agriculture. Beatrice said earlier on, the main problem that we have for the loss of biodiversity is the loss of land, of forests, in particular tropical forests, in favor of farming land. And it's farming land that doesn't produce a lot, and therefore it's extensive growth, whereas we need intensive growth, including because we must soon feed 10 billion human beings in 2058, and we will have the effects of climate change that will lower the yields. So we must intensify the technologization of agriculture to feed more people with less land and to give back to nature all of the land that we've grabbed from it. Thank you, and I will end with you, Beatrice.
Thing, and I can do it urgently today, I would implement a system to save the Amazon, which is the COP right now. It is in the Amazon, and there are already a lot of good proposals around for both nature restoration, for funding nature restoration privately, and for conservation as well. So this is the opportunity of this year.
Priorité à l'Amazon. Merci, merci à tous. On peut les applaudir.
Thank you very much. We can give them a round of applause. A lot of proposals and a lot of optimism for the future, and that is tremendous. Any questions from the room? I can see some hands raising here. Can you introduce yourself, please? Yes, hello. I'm Alexis Ney. I'm in preparatory school for higher education. I have two simple questions to ask you all. The first, should we reduce or increase the pollution duties? And the second is with regard to polluters pay. But for example, again, faced with the ultra-rich, such as Jeff Bezos who got married in Venice, and the fines paid by that person are ridiculous with regard to his weight in the economy, all of the gaffers. So should we, Antoine Préau, I couldn't hear very well. Should we harshen the polluter pays? No, we need to apply it to everywhere, to all pollutions. But add to this a second part of the principle, which is to help those who depollute. So why did the carbon tax make so much damage that it's been buried in France? It's because we called it a tax. It's not a tax, but it's a duty of polluters pay. It's a principle of pollution, which is a negative externality when we work, and to remedy this. And the fact that it didn't go well is because the duty was collected, but we didn't know where it went. If we had helped people to, for example, use the money to buy electric cars, then maybe it would have gone better. So we must have both of these sides and apply it to all pollutions and not only certain pollutions. So, for example, for carbon today, only the big carbon emitters are taxed with the famous right to pollute. So the principle of the polluters pay would allow us to go faster. Yes, a comment and a response, and we're going to land on the conclusion because there's a big red stop. Your question is very interesting. It leads us to observe that it's far more complicated to define tools and public policies, and it partially responds to the question of why. That's what you said, Raphael. Why is it lower down on the agenda? Well, because it's more complicated, so we have to really engage public debate around this question. So I'm going to recycle, because this morning it so happened that I introduced and participated in the moderation of the session on youth policies. And youth policies naturally tend to speak, and we spoke broadly, about education and access to jobs. And the idea I tried to promote was that the best policy for youth was not to deliver a highly degraded climate, and this can also be applied to biodiversity. Thank you. One last word.
I just want to see the system not only penalize the bad deed, but also reward a good deed. Example is Amazon. I think that Europe tried to introduce that penalty to import tax something that if they see that the product deforests the Amazon. But vice versa, if you can also adopt a policy to provide the resources to indigenous people, the forest community, so that they have an incentive to increase the asset of the nature of the. That is very much actually Beatrice right. That proposal. It's only so we need to see both. That's why I'm saying that the nature as an asset class. Oui. If we can do it, that will be very good.
Très bien, merci beaucoup à tous. Il est 20h. Merci d'être restés jusqu'à présent. Vous pouvez les applaudir. Antoine FRÉROT, Naoko ISHII, Bris Rocher, Justin VAИSSSE et Béatrice WEDER. Merci à tous et bonne soirée.